If I could have your attention, please. If Paul Bracken, if not me, if Paul Bracken can have your attention, we want to welcome him. Coming back to Columbia, he was a Columbia undergrad. He graduated from the engineering school here. So he's, I hope anyway, happy to be back. So welcome, Paul. Let me just say a couple of things about what he's done since then. He's done a lot. He's now a professor at Yale in the School of Management and Political Science as well. He wrote one of the first books about nuclear command and control. Since then, he's written books like Fire in the East about the rise of military power and missiles and nuclear weapons in Asia and how that was changing the world balance of power. More recently, he's been working on new projects having to do with applying risk analysis in international security. He also works in things like applying techniques of net assessment and other kinds of forecasting. So for all these reasons, we're really happy to have him here because this program, after all, is not just about history, it's also about what that history helps us in thinking about the future. So tonight he's going to be talking to us about the second nuclear age. So with no further ado, let me turn things over to Paul. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matt. It's really a deep honor to come back here and to be standing in the front of the room rather than taking notes here. When I was at Columbia, it was a very, very different environment. And I don't want to, if anybody wants to hear old lang syne about the 1960s and early 70s, and knew a couple people who didn't make it through, as they say. Well, let me just one other anecdote about how this. I got at it here in 1971 with an engineering degree, and had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And so I worked as a busboy for a while in Philadelphia. But then I saw an ad in the Washington Post that said, interesting national security work, engineering background, 10 years ASW experience required. So I sent my resume in. To the younger people in the audience, there was a time when you had paper resumes and mailed them into companies, long since gone. To my amazement, I got a job interview in Roslyn, Virginia, and the guy interviewed me, and he says, you have 10 years ASW experience, because I was 22, maybe 23, and I said, well, I don't really know, because I don't know what the letters ASW stand for. Who knows what ASW stands for? Okay. It stands for Anti-Submarine Warfare. And so, amazingly enough, they needed a junior person, and I got this job because of my ebullient personality, I'm sure. And I spent the first couple of months looking at the tape of Soviet nuclear weapon-firing submarines up around Greenland, United Kingdom, Iceland, Gap. We would somehow get these tapes of what they were doing and conversations in strange languages like Russian, and we would analyze them at this company. And a little bit later, I got into a project. This was still in the first year. There's a lesson I want to get across here. To look at back in the Cold War days, we looked at, I'm not kidding, the role of urban sprawl in Western Europe to stop the Warsaw Pact armies. Like blowing up buildings to drop them on the Autobahns to slow down the Russian tanks. And to do this work, I had to go down to Fort Benning, Fort Belvoir, and to Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and take every weapon in the U.S. arsenal and blow up buildings to see what happened. You know, I mean, I don't know how you feel, the young men in the audience, but to be 23 years old and go to work and pull the lanyard on a 155 and blow up and demolish a building. This was the best job I have ever had. If I often think of this when I'm leaving a faculty meeting at Yale about how a 155 would be real useful to set the record straight. But the lesson here for the younger people in the audience is all sorts of things will happen to you in your careers that you can't possibly anticipate. And if you see an advantage, an opportunity that looks interesting, just take it. And all sorts of interesting things will come from that. You know, I guess what they say at graduation speeches, follow your passion. Okay, let me turn to the subject at hand. I have a book which I've completed, should be coming out early next year. Don't have a publisher yet, but we're getting there. And I'm going to give you the big picture points of this thing, and then we can have a conversation to flesh in the details, or I'd love to get your comments and questions on really any aspect of it, because I learn all the time. As I get older, I realize how much you never stop needing to learn and actually, at least in my case, actually learning. I think the pictures of the future that much of the academic establishment has, think tanks have, planning agencies inside the Washington Beltway, outside the Washington Beltway, but government has, are too rosy, and I don't think they realize just how bad things can get as a consequence of the spread of the atomic bomb. My view is that I don't know who's going to get the bomb in future years. I can imagine a wide range of possibilities. Iran, Saudi Arabia. I don't really know. My ability to predict that isn't any better than yours. But I do know one thing. There's one scenario about who gets the bomb that I can't imagine, and that's nuclear disarmament. Far from it, my view is that the nuclear weapons are becoming more deeply embedded in international relations just about than they have ever been. It's true that we don't have these supersized arsenals as we had in the Cold War, and we should thank our lucky stars for that. Whatever happens in this second nuclear age, this is an age where many countries, 10, 12, or more, have the bomb, possibly terrorist groups do, a real nightmare. But whatever happens in that world, it's not going to be as bad as what could have happened in the first nuclear age, which is the Cold War. Trust me, I have a background in physics and engineering. If 1% of those arsenals had ever gone off in the Cold War, there is no words that could possibly describe what would have happened. It's bad, but it ain't that bad. What's bad now, though, is the defining feature of a second nuclear age, and that is you have multiple decision-making centers, which really changes the game profoundly. But far from moving toward a world where you are eliminating the bomb, I think it's going in the opposite direction, where nuclear weapons is all that some of these countries have for their security and their status in peacetime in situations that have nothing whatsoever to do with crises, yet alone nuclear wars. We were chatting earlier, and just one little fact here is there's 9 nuclear weapons states in the world today. 8 of them have spent billions of dollars to modernize their nuclear arsenals. Maybe this does or doesn't mean the U.S. should follow suit, but it ought to mean something. And the United States is the only country, it's number 9, it's the only country that is not modernizing its nuclear forces. We can get into a discussion of whether we should or we shouldn't. I don't think, well, that's not my point. My point is that there's a broad macro trend and nuclear weapons are becoming more embedded in international affairs. I see no possibility in the foreseeable future of a global zero. I say that with regret. I wish there were. I am one of the biggest supporters of global zero. If you're an American looking at American national interests, I don't see how you couldn't. But my problem is that other countries like Russia, China, India see that also and conclude that this is a world in which it's much worse from their point of view because it gives conventional advantages to the United States. So my big point is that we are entering a second nuclear age, and we don't realize how bad it could get. I would say that this subject of sort of where the world is going in a macro sense, we could look at it with a number of different frameworks. One framework which I find popular in political science and public policy is the optimism-pessimism framework. Is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? my own view, and we can have a discussion about this is not a particularly useful debate. If you were to go back historically, there are many instances when, for a variety of reasons, different sides, including the United States, exaggerated the threat in general, and it also exaggerated the spread of the atomic bomb. President Kennedy did say that I don't have the numbers in front of me, but you've probably all heard it, that by the early 60s, by the early 1980s, there'd be something like 25 nuclear weapons countries. And that didn't come close to happening. If you look into where he got that estimate, where it came from a DOD estimate, which you can pull off of the web, which was much more conservative, much more of the view that there wouldn't be that many countries by the early 1980s. Okay. But the point I would make is really, and I could give many other examples of the bomb. If you take WMD to be the spread of the bomb, a surrogate for it, chemical weapons, we believed that the U.S. government believed that Saddam Hussein would have some chemical weapons. I know a lot of these people, and I believe that they believed that they would find not nuclear weapons, but some chemical weapons. They really did. This was, in my view, not concocted out of whole cloth. We can argue that. But the situation looking forward is different in a number of fundamental ways. To compare the situation today to 1963 or 1973, you have today vast, huge, bureaucratic military-industrial complexes in North Korea, India, Pakistan, now Iran, certainly in China, that have tremendous momentum behind them. You are going to have, in my view, or at least you have to consider the scenarios where you have direct economic stakes and incentives to perpetuate these bureaucracies, increasingly a large fraction of which are devoted to nuclear weapons. You have the possibility for opportunistic, hustling strategists to use it to climb to the top of their government agencies or higher office. You have a globalization force in the world today which is pulling countries apart. Nationalism is needed to pull them together, and the atomic bomb, I will argue, has a lot to do with nationalism. So I would accept this fact that the optimism-pessimism debate was a useful way to look at it in the past. I don't think to take the fact that the U.S. overestimated the spread of the bomb in the past, I don't think that's a persuasive argument looking for the future. Okay. Now, what are some other features of this new era, which I'm calling a second nuclear age? All I mean by that is that many countries will have the bomb, and this will have a deep and, in some cases, decisive impact on their international security relations with each other and with the future design of their own strategic postures. So, for example, virtually all the armies I can think about in Asia now are being cut back and shrunk. Resources are being pulled for those and put into higher technology areas. That's one example. So it's going to have an impact on civil-military relations as it did in the United States and the old Soviet Union. It's my view that as we go into this era, that the problems will not be, we need to switch our frameworks. I mentioned optimism, pessimism. The other framework, which is predominant in the United States, is, of course, nuclear nonproliferation, built around the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1970, but it has many other features, and people are talking about extending this treaty. I am a big supporter of the NPT. I think we should keep it. I think we have to change frameworks to go beyond it to get into questions about managing our way into the through a second nuclear age. We have to look at coercion, and we have to look at escalation, not exclusively nuclear nonproliferation. Just to be clear here, I think it would be better if if nuclear nonproliferation did work, okay, and that we didn't have to face these problems. It is now well beyond the point where we can get away with that exclusively. So the question is, there are better and worse ways to get through a second nuclear age, just like there was the first nuclear age. We tend to have this view of the Cold War, first nuclear age, that it was some kind of an all-out arms race. Let me tell you that the first nuclear age, the Cold War, could have been far worse than it was. There was extraordinarily moderated behavior. The United States was not involved in an arms race ever in the Cold War, in my view. It was at most, in certain years of intense, sour relations with Moscow, an arms walk. We were never spending, for 1 year we spent 10% of the GDP. Most of the time it was more like 5 or 6% of the GDP, dramatically dropping on the latter parts of the Cold War. So any competition can be intense, less intense. Any competition can be reckless and dangerous, or prudent and conservative. My plea, what my book is about, is shifting a focus so we pursue the safer, prudent, moderate paths as best we can divine them in advance, rather than the other ones, which are reckless and dangerous. I would further say that if we don't think about these things beforehand, we're not going to discern what these safer paths might be. That's my argument in a nutshell. To illustrate some sort of additional features of this, if you were to look at the political science, public policy, security policy literature, you would find two gigantic collections of books. One is on nuclear nonproliferation, and I'll include all the related work on regime theory, which establishes global regimes against this or that, for this or that taking place. The other stream of literature, there actually is considerable literature on deterrence post-Cold War, like how do you deter Iran? And this gets into this whole subject of what's happening today in Washington, of U.S. policy morphing before our very eyes from nuclear non-proliferation to containment. All right. You'd find these huge literatures, but you would find at most 1 or 2 books on escalation. If that sounds provocative, let's say you'd find 1 or 2 books at most on escalation and de-escalation. It just might be important how we deal with other countries or how they deal with each other, say Israel and Iran. Can they form a deterrent relationship? I argue that you cannot intelligently address that question without also including escalation of each against the other and how that would involve the United States. So there's huge tranches of literature which were well developed in the Cold War, which suggest topics that we need to study again for a second nuclear age. Closely related to this is the whole subject of what does a strategic posture for the United States look like? What does a strategic posture for China look like? How are we even using the term strategic posture? Okay. If one steps back and looks at the technological revolution going on in the world today, you find a revolution in military fields at least as great as went on in the 1950s and the 1960s. It is different from that era. So, for example, there's precision strike. If you can find a target, you can pretty well kill it today with a conventional weapon. There is cyber attack, using information warfare attacks to do all kinds of things. The cyber attack community, and it's really growing quickly, it's a growth business in Washington, D.C., that's for sure, doesn't look at the question of the relationship of cyber attack to nuclear weapons. When I wrote my book, the first book on command and control of nuclear forces, one of the arguments that it made was if you actually have to take out another side in a military strike, the intelligent course of behavior, both looking at it from a scientific point of view and also my belief as to what countries would actually do, what their militaries would tell their civilians, is to go for a headshot, to go for a command structure attack as the rational course of behavior. Back then, we didn't really have cyber warfare attacks which could paralyze a command and control system for a number of hours while missiles, conventional or perhaps nuclear, came in. I can't find a single paper on this. And it seems to me, I'm not advocating it as a strategy I want to emphasize, but as scholars of this subject, we need to step back and see, does this look attractive to other countries? Enemies as well as allies, because one of the other insights that falls out of this, if you think about it for 5 minutes, is that in a multipolar nuclear world, nuclear allies could be just as dangerous as nuclear opponents. Okay, so let me just sort of briefly go over a couple of regions here. We want to preserve as much time as we can for conversation. Let's go from west to east. What's going on, like in the Middle East? Just some things. And here, I don't want to get into, what the mullahs might do, but just what's going on in terms of the dynamics of the region. The dynamics of the region is that Israel built a nuclear force which was designed for use at some future distant point in an environment where nobody else had long-range missiles and nobody else had nuclear weapons in the region. The big enemy of the Israeli nuclear force was the reconnaissance satellite, which could take a photograph of one of her nuclear birds, missiles, or airplanes, and all of the political trouble that would cause back in the 1980s or early 1990s. That world doesn't exist anymore. You'd have to be, so optimistic about the future if you didn't consider, if you were an Israeli planner and you didn't consider what's it going to be like to live in a world where Iran has 10 or 20 nuclear missiles, mobile launch missiles that can reach Israel. What I'm saying is Israel's going to have to shift her deterrent to sea. This is going to happen for reasons of elementary operations research as much as it is for reasons of political science. It probably means, by my calculations, Israel's going to need more nuclear weapons of different sizes and shapes and structures. You may have seen that last summer she put a Dolphin-class submarine through the Suez Canal with the permission of the Egyptian government, almost surely to be a signal to Iran. All right. Now, the Dolphin submarine is reported to have nuclear warheads aboard it. I don't know whether they will or they won't. It doesn't matter. What matters is that nuclear signaling of a kind that went on in the first nuclear age isn't a hypothetical possibility. It is already happening in the second nuclear age. Denying it doesn't make it go away. Going to the sort of South Asia area, the forces of India and Pakistan are growing. Pakistan, as you know, if you're doing research in this field, is building a very significant plutonium complex for reprocessing to supplement her uranium bombs. And why do you want plutonium weapons if you have uranium weapons? Well, it turns out that the engineering behind these things is that plutonium is easier to work with for odd-shaped warheads of a kind that you would put on anti-ship missiles at sea. Pakistan is set to move a significant fraction of her force to sea. Almost surely, it seems, well, almost surely, that a scenario which ought to be considered is an attempt to surround India. India is doing likewise. As you know, she has a nuclear weapon firing submarine, which we understand at the moment has no nuclear weapons aboard. But it's only a matter of time, it seems to me, where the scenario of a nuclear arms race in the Indian Ocean between India and Pakistan is going to be something that's going to have to be managed by the United States. we will have to inject some intelligent opinion into this. We could urge them not to do it. I personally have done that in 1998 when India under Prime Minister Vajpayee detonated the May 1998 surprise shots. I wrote him a letter, and I sent it to the Indian ambassador in Washington, D.C. Dear Mr. Vajpayee, you should take that money that you're spending on nuclear forces and spend it on hospitals, on education, and roads. I've been to India recently, and let me emphasize the roads, because there's a real problem here. And I got back a very nice reply from not from him, but from the ambassador. Looked very much like a form letter, like a form rejection letter from graduate school or something. Dear Professor Bracken, Prime Minister Vajpayee always values your opinions. All right. I make sure he gets this information, and I'm sure he'll put it into his calculus of what he does. All right. What is the role of the U.S. Navy going to be? What is the role of confidence-building measures? What is arms control going to look like when there's an arms race in the Indian Ocean? Or we continue to get by with getting on a soapbox and say, don't do it, like the Catholic priests said about child abuse in the Catholic Church, ignoring it as it built up? I think we are really very much in a different world. Finally, in East Asia, you have the Chinese modernization, and it is it's just very impressive. I mean, China, as you know, is building road mobile missiles, the DF-31s, which is going to give China a much more agile, quick-reacting nuclear force. I mean, I can remember people that would always say China has a minimum deterrent. The term minimum deterrent comes from the U.S. Navy in the 1950s. It is an invented term, okay, in the United States. It's never been acknowledged by China, and China never had a minimum deterrent as used here. Minimum deterrent just so we're on the same sheet of paper, is a force that can survive a first strike and retaliate against the person who fires it. But you don't need many of them. And it's offered as an alternative to the kind of sick level of over-armament that the superpowers engaged in, where you had each side with, I don't know, I stopped counting after 35,000 nuclear warheads. It was completely insane. All right. But we're here to look at the second nuclear age, not the first. So China never had a survivable nuclear force. She will, and the Chinese will have an ability to nuclearize, if you will, any crisis. I'm not saying she will. The capability that she will be noticed by the United States. In addition, China has a significant precision strike force of 800-plus missiles that she's building up as of 2010. It's going up every 3 months. There's new deployments. And these are conventional warheads that many people argue can target U.S. surface ships in the Western Pacific, leading to very interesting escalation dynamics in the Western Pacific and very interesting political implications for countries like South Korea, Japan, Australia, and Southeast Asia, which I think we just need a lot more work thinking about. Okay. I'm not here to depress you. I'm here to drive home the first point I made, which is these rosy scenarios that I see in the Quadrennial Defense Review inside the Beltway think tanks, university studies, I think greatly underestimate how bad things could get, and that we need to think about those things, not just nuclear nonproliferation. The way I'd put it this way, current U.S. policy is to emphasize nuclear nonproliferation to the exclusion of almost anything else. As I go to Washington, I can see this morph before my very eyes into containment. It's very striking about yes, we don't accept the Iranian or North Korean nuclear weapons, but what are we going to do about them? So we will shift to a containment policy. And you know what about this containment policy? For the next few years, it will be a spectacular success. It will be a spectacular success. Just as nonproliferation policy was a spectacular success in the 1970s, save for the 1974 India shots. Because anything would work over the next few years. When you only have a handful of nuclear weapons, those countries are probably not going to want to take many risks, and they're not going to be challenged. So we're in an environment where almost any policy would work. What does it mean to work? When we have a policy, we have to ask the question, will it work when there's no stresses on it? And then we have to ask, how will it work when it's being stressed? What would a missile crisis look like between Israel and Iran? What would be the dynamics of that? So what I think is happening, what should happen, and frankly what will happen, is that we have this sort of non-proliferation and containment, morphing into containment on one column. Where we need to go is to think about some aspects of dynamics and instability. So I see dynamics, by which I mean that these systems can change and take on a very different trajectory in a short period of time. We need to ask whether or not fear and prudence, which were the governing mechanisms of the Cold War, are likely to be as effective in India-Pakistan or in the Middle East. And as far as the other feature of this new era that I think we need to look at, instability, this just opens up a whole raft of questions about the relationship of conventional forces to nuclear forces. So in conclusion, I think we are entering a second nuclear age. I think we need to emphasize its dynamics and its instabilities in order to manage our way through it as best we can. And the final point I would make is that the greatest source of concern for me is stepping back from the rivalries and the competitiveness, looking at this just as a global structural problem. It's the end of the monopoly of over nuclear weapons by major powers. Is that what we're witnessing today? This is like a monopolistic industry where two players controlled it. And yes, other players can come in, but they're major powers. What we're seeing today, and have for the past 10 years or so, is minor powers, secondary powers, are also getting the bomb. Iran's, Korea's, frankly, Israel. And that this has really deep structural implications for world order for some time to come. So those are my thoughts and the sort of the core arguments of the book. I'd be happy to go into any details, issues we haven't brought up, or other aspects of this, what I'm sure promises to be a very interesting conversation. So thank you very much.
So I'd like to ask the first question, but if you have questions, please come up to the microphone. So earlier you mentioned that when you look back, at Kennedy's prediction, which as it turns out was, as you said, overstating Defense Department's own estimate of the extent of proliferation, the rapidity of proliferation. Sure. You said that just because they were wrong then doesn't mean that we're likely to overestimate proliferation now. Can we learn something from mistakes in forecasting proliferation?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, here? Can you, all right. Yeah, I think we can learn a lot. We can learn a lot about overestimation and underestimation. We can learn a lot about the Cold War because the lessons of the Cold War, it's really hard to find anybody who's written an article or book called Lessons of the Cold War that isn't like very normative. But let me come to your question, Matt. Yeah, I think there's what this shows is really fascinating to me. It's the tendency of leaders, and this is a lesson of the Cold War, not to understand their own forces or their own bureaucracy. President Kennedy had no basis from any DoD study, yet he made this exaggerated forecast. You'll find that it strikes me as related that if you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and what Kennedy said. It turns out that he had just signed off on the revised nuclear strike plans for the United States, for the Strategic Air Command, of a kind that there's been a lot of recently declassified scholarship on. And these were drawn up by the Air Force, and they argued for different packages of forces so you didn't escalate by hitting Russian cities at the outset. So he signs this thing. Literally within days, he goes on TV and overturns his own doctrine. The notion that we had a single stable doctrine, or that leaders understood their own forces, whether estimating future threat environments or tomorrow morning's threat environments, cannot be sustained when you look at the Cold War. The way this is put is that there's a couple ways to put it. One is technology and the doctrinal lag. Technology races ahead of doctrine or strategy for understanding it. Just one example, in the 1950s, if you look at the history of, in the classic books like Wizards of Armageddon, it describes about first strike and second strike. What he doesn't tell you, okay, is that nobody recognized these distinctions until actually after they had deployed missiles. It's only when the technology is out there that the bureaucracy can become aware, and this is measured in years, not months. So we're in a more dynamic, volatile situation, which, when I look back at the Cold War, I'm very thankful that it didn't go off into a more extreme direction, as I believe it did not. I'm much less assured that this won't take off in negative directions in a second nuclear age.
I guess I still have the floor then, so I could ask a follow-up. The follow-up is well, you said that we underestimate the way in which technology can drive change. I mean, there are those who would argue that one of the reasons why we got these forecasts wrong, that we overestimated the pace of proliferation, is that the people who were making these estimates were only looking at the technology, were looking at the capability. Noticing, for instance, countries like Switzerland, Sweden, and so on could get nuclear weapons if they wanted them. What was harder was forecasting the politics, the decision-making, and not just the capability. Have we gotten any better at that, and isn't that still a crucial variable?
See, I would say that in the earlier excessively negative forecasts of proliferation, that we got the politics wrong and the technology wrong. Pakistan, North Korea, Iran, Libya, the notion that they could have gone nuclear, and they were on McNamara's list, the DOD study that was sent to the White House, and what happened there, I don't know. We greatly exaggerated how easy it was to get fissile material for the 1960s, 70s, and even into the 1980s. We also got the politics wrong. But I would say that we did not do a kind of narrow, apolitical technological projection. It was much worse than that. We got both of these things wrong. So have we gotten better at this? I got to believe we have. I mean, the Iranian nuclear weapon program has got to be the most studied clandestine program, nuclear weapons program, of any in history. All right. So it doesn't mean we'll make the right policy choices about it. I guess what surprises me is that we see this thing coming. And I'm just, the debate in Washington seems to me so simplistic about an Iranian nuclear weapon. Boiling everything down to two possibilities. The mullahs are crazy, or they're not. They're going to build these nuclear weapons and they'll hit the button and blow up Israel the first chance. Then you get anybody who's an Iranian expert with any level of expertise or knowledge, even if they don't speak Farsi, they say, no, that's just not the way they operate. So then we revert to the other thing. There's nothing, what are they going to do with it? Because of deterrence. I suggest there's more than two options, two possibilities that could happen, and we need to explore those in detail and whatever.
Okay, I think Harrison was first, and then Chris.
Okay.
Harrison.
Could you take a case and explain a little bit in a more detailed way about how we would take a better understanding of a concept like escalation and apply it to the strategies and tactics that we use?
Yeah, okay. Give you a couple thoughts on that. And let me emphasize here that what I'm calling for is a changed framework. I'm not trying to get in to see the president to tell him what to do about these things. That's a different problem altogether, okay? On the question about escalation, I would say to draw up a list, like on the blackboard, of reasons for escalation, which we haven't done. People look at escalation, well, why would you worsen the crisis? I can't, so, and my response would be, because you don't have any other choice. In other words, write a paper on counter-escalation as a response to the other side's move. All right. If you were to write a paper on counter-escalation in the Middle East today, and it was 20 pages, you would be the world expert on it, because you've given more thought to it in 1 week than the Pentagon or CIA has. Another example, de-escalation and escalation are not the same things. Because escalation, you do damage to the other side. De-escalation, you're coming down, and you can lower the tensions, but you can't undo the damage if you've launched some kind of strikes. So that's example number 2, to draw a distinction between the dynamics of escalation and the dynamics of de-escalation. Third, how to cross a threshold in a way that will make sense to another country, not just a bunch of old white men sitting around a room in Washington, D.C. Okay. You want a fourth? Okay, a fourth one is, what sort of conventions should we establish, and what are the major problems that we really should be able to anticipate, so you can start a design of mechanisms which would make this age safer than it would otherwise be, okay? What I'm saying is, if you go back and you look at the Cold War, one of the reasons it turned out well for us, that we bought time and nobody blew each other up, was just because there was a series of conventions and understandings by the two sides. And I'm not talking about confidence-building measures. I'm talking about lines which everybody understood. We were allowed to put Air Force bases with nuclear weapons and ring the Soviet Union. They were not allowed to do that to us. Okay? When they did that, we considered it a major escalation when they put missiles into Cuba. That was the cause of the Cuban Missile Crisis, in my view. All right? But these asymmetries in conventions were established by power realities, not ideal situations. So if a paper that is actually discussed in my book is some ideas about the first crisis of the second nuclear age. And why, when we look at that, we should not look at that from the point of view of, let's get out of the crisis as soon as possible. We should look at it from the point of view of, let's get out of the crisis as soon as possible, and other frameworks, such as what precedents we're setting. We were very lucky in the Cold War that the first crisis, its first crisis, was the Berlin crisis of 1948, which was extraordinarily incremental, slow motion, and controlled because there was no direct shooting between the two sides. I don't know the answer to this question, but if some other country, an nth country, starts a nuclear crisis with a U.S. ally, or just in general, is the idea to get out of this thing as soon as possible? Or is it to use it as an opportunity to make such a statement that this would never be allowed again? And if we were trying to do that, we would escalate in a very different way.
I thought Chris, and then...
Actually, my question's been answered.
Oh, okay. Yes, if you would speak to the microphone. Thanks.
My name is Hamida Sedri, and I'm from Harvard University. Thank you for your presentation. I enjoyed it. You mentioned earlier that in thinking about Iran, Washington is thinking that either the mullahs are crazy or they're not crazy within the context of whether or not they may strike against
Right.
Israel. I've been hearing similar arguments during the past few weeks or so, and I can't help but think that isn't it really Washington that is crazy, not the mullahs? Why? Why I say this is because Israel is the one who's had nuclear power for a number of years, as you pointed out, since late 70s or early 80s. In fact, it was Washington that helped Iran during the time of the Shah to come up with its earlier plans. But my point here is that Israel is the one who's been the aggressor in using its power to denuclearize, if you
Right.
will, Middle Eastern powers
Right.
such as Saddam Hussein, such as Hafiz al-Assad, and so on, not Iran. So is it possible, and you made a very interesting point by suggesting that you really like to see a change in the framework. Do you mean a change in the discourse of the framework, or what do you really have in mind, in particular with respect to Iran and Israel?
Okay. The answer to your question is, do I think Washington is crazy the way it's been handling these things? Yes. Okay. I was watching C-SPAN the other day, and a senior U.S. government official was on television giving a press conference about Israel, and not a discussion at one of the unquote think tanks, and was smirking when somebody in the audience asked the same question: why has the U.S. allowed Israel to get nuclear weapons? And there was a smirk on his face.
Right.
I don't think it's funny. I mean, I can see why he thinks it's funny. I'm not going to be the first official of the U.S. government you're going to put into a corner and get me to admit by accident that Israel has nuclear weapons. But this is so dangerous what's building up. And they don't understand that it is dangerous. You know why? Because when they go into work each day, it isn't dangerous. They've never been stared into the face of nuclear war for very interesting generational reasons, and they really haven't thought deeply about what's going on in terms of how bad things could get. I mean, let me tell you, a missile crisis between Israel and Iran, I have gamed out many times for the U.S. government, and it can get really, really bad in terms of wins and losses for our ally without a shot being fired. I decry this, but I'm not in the business of finger pointing. I have to look at this in a more constructive way, and I have to look to the future. And we better take seriously getting a missile crisis which makes the Cuban Missile Crisis pale in comparison between several countries. It's not the only problem with the second nuclear raid. There's the whole arms racing thing. I can't find anybody who recognizes the Israelis are going to move their deterrent to sea with all kinds of implications. And it sort of reflects a lack of seriousness, in my view. I'm not the only one who thinks this, by the way.
So how would you change the framework then?
How would I change the framework? The question is, how do I change the framework? What I do is that I write things. I think you're raising a larger question. Where is the locus of discussion for productive conversations and debate about these matters? And there's a list of where the locus of discussion could be or should be. Okay? One answer could be a new administration comes in and understands these things. I've been around long enough to know that if they haven't thought about this before they get into office, it's too late. So another answer is think tanks. Maybe they should do it. Maybe universities should do it. Maybe journalists should do it. Maybe other groups should do it. And maybe on that list is the way, unfortunately, this is usually managed in the United States, all right? And that is a disaster hits. And everybody's shocked into sort of paying attention.
I have a few questions. Please come up to the microphone because we're live streaming this over the internet, so for the sake of our internet audience. Thanks.
Yeah, hi, I wanted to ask you if you could say a little bit more about the new ways maybe of delivering nuclear weapons. Are there new innovations in this area, and how close are we to this mythical suitcase nuclear bomb that could be used by terrorists?
Yeah, the question is how are there new delivery mechanisms for nuclear weapons? There are, in the sense that the proliferating countries are now being able to put them on missiles. I mean, if you looked at the data from the 40s and 50s, and you said, what feature of nuclear weapons changed faster than anything else? The answer is shrinking the physics package. So I think that's not the thrust of your question, but they're going to be able to put them on missiles. They will figure this out. The suitcase bomb, the United States had, and the Soviets had suitcase bombs in the Cold War. I don't really know how easy it is to build these things. I mean, I'm physics background, a gun-type bomb should not be that hard. But to get access to the engineering disciplines to put that all together is quite a project. There's no doubt that a nation state could be able to build a suitcase bomb. There's I think little doubt that they could do that. And these things are very difficult to detect for reasons of physics. And that is a danger that subnational groups will get these. I don't mean to minimize those dangers. We were chatting earlier, and I've been giving talks about this, and people say, well, I don't worry about Iran so much. It's terrorists I worry about. And we don't get to choose if it's Iran or terrorists. We could get both. And increasingly the world looks that way to me. So you solve one problem, it doesn't make the other one go away.
Thank you. I'll ask the next question. Thank you for a stimulating discussion. One of the things that crossed my mind during your discussion was, and I like your opinion, as to one of the reasons why the estimates might have been way off base in terms of the number of nuclear powers is that it seems to take an enemy to force a country to think about developing nuclear weapons. Now, the three cases you cited, the three pairs of contestants, so to speak, India and Pakistan, North Korea and South Korea, or the U.S. or Japan, and Israel and Iran. If you look at those three situations, in two of the cases, they're historical, well, in almost all the cases, they're historical grievances that are driving this. Have you thought about the possibility of having some supranational mechanism monitoring it or acquiring the responsibility for it, such as the Perm 5 UN Security Council? And here's one case that's very much in the news today, and that is the Korean situation, where you have the U.S. and China, which are kind of in an adversarial position with respect to the Korean Peninsula. In China's case, in my opinion, looking past the danger of a nuclear North Korea could pose or poses for China, what would it take for the U.S. and China to kind of coordinate their diplomacy? Would it take a crisis or or if the U.S. were to convey the message that unless there is a joint effort, that basically we'll have to take matters into our own hands because our security is threatened if the North Koreans were to develop a missile that could conceivably reach Russia. So could you
yes.
speak to that? Thank you.
Sure. That the U.S. government under both past several administrations had many dialogues with China We even have an official dialogue now called the Strategic Dialogue, which gets into this, why it is. We tell them it's not in your interest to have a nuclear North Korea. They agree, and then nothing happens. And the same for Russia with respect to a nuclear Iran, because that's not too cool from their point of view. And I have thought about this, and it seems to me, I mean, I don't know what your impressions of me already are, but I actually think there's great prospect for advancing this as an idea. In other words, I think what could happen is that a great power arms control system replaces the NPT system. You described the NPT when you said it would be the PERM 5. I think you were using that as an illustrative example.
Well, there is a military staff committee within the UN apparatus.
There is, and it's coincidental that the 5 official nuclear powers, legitimate nuclear powers under the NPT, are in the PERM 5. This brings up France and Britain, which to me it's so absurd that they're in the PERM 5, given their power situation today compared to 1945. But I'll take what I can get. It seems to me that the potential for a great power arms control agreement really could increase sharply if there is a spectacular nuclear catastrophe involving these weapons. And that you might get an agreement which, if you looked at it today, you would be laughed out of the room as being a starry-eyed illusionist. But if one or two cities had just gone up and been destroyed, I can imagine the president and the Chinese and the Russians sitting down and saying, look, there's a lot in here that you don't like, sign it. And they would. I can easily imagine that. And I think the situation is approaching a danger level where that could actually happen, not in today's environment. I really don't think that's feasible. But down the road, and there's much more thought needs to be devoted to that. In the early 80s, I was a consultant to something called the Catholic's Pastoral Letter on War and Peace, which was the Catholic bishop's statement that nuclear deterrence was immoral, but it was okay if you used it on a temporary basis. As long as you used the time and energy so you could get rid of nuclear weapons and lessen your reliance on deterrence. In my view, neither superpower did that. There were some efforts. Let's give credit where credit is due. Several U.S. presidents, people don't realize, seriously thought of getting rid of nuclear weapons. From Harry Truman to Dwight Eisenhower to Ronald Reagan to President Obama. This isn't entirely new. Nonetheless, it seems to me we should be thinking about plans which would look completely infeasible today from a political point of view, but wouldn't after something happened.
This is a question you asked earlier in your talk. Why do we use this word posture to describe a nuclear strategic posture?
You raise a good subject, which is why do we use the words we use, of which posture is one. I don't know the answer to that. It's been around for a long time, but it didn't exist in World War II. It really existed. It came out of the RAND Corporation in the 1950s, is my sense, in which you had to put together a mixture of bombers, missiles, and submarines, and then that was broadened to look at the interaction of conventional forces with nuclear forces. All right. Today, we have really not looked at our portfolio of forces in anything like the systematic way we did in the past, although we could. But there's a lot to be learned about why we use the words we use, and I would encourage you to look at the history of these things. It's a very good question.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. My name is Jeff. I'm an undergraduate at Crosstown at Hunter College. My question is, I noticed earlier you mentioned the Iranian nuclear weapons program, as a matter of fact, as though it existed. And I was a little surprised that I was sitting in the back, but I didn't think I saw anybody blink at that statement. What makes you think that there is in fact a nuclear weapons program in Iran? Are there asymmetries of information between us and you that liken you to think that way?
Okay.
Thanks.
I don't have any inside information from Ahmadinejad to telling me that, how many he's planning on building. When I look at the totality of evidence, which is their secrecy, their history of lying about this and getting caught, doesn't seem to affect them much, and the hardening of their nuclear infrastructure, and the political character of that regime and its view of Israel and the United States, and the whole revolutionary ferment, and my belief, I don't leave it there. Whether the Shah had nuclear plans or not, I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows. But when I look at the totality of that information, I'm not saying that I have definitive evidence that they do. I think looking at a problem like this in terms of U.S. legal standards of evidence or scientific standards of proof and publication in a peer journal is the wrong way to look at it. I think that's where we might part company. So, no, I don't have the inside information, but I think that's the wrong way to do it. That does open me and people of my view to possibilities of exaggerating things, admitted. When I look at the evidence and the dangers, I think we have to consider scenarios where they are building nuclear weapons and what they would mean.
Earlier you said that the first crisis of the second nuclear age would be extremely important, or could be anyway, and could even be useful. But haven't we already had the first crisis? I mean, I think different people maybe have different candidates, but wasn't the Iraq War in effect an effort to, you might say it was to create a crisis in order to manage a crisis in order to get a specific outcome. So.
Yeah, fair enough. And this came up in an earlier question about exaggerated estimates. That did we get the technology wrong and the politics wrong, but technology right? And I said, no, we got both wrong. The reason the U.S. government thought that there was a bomber gap and a missile gap in the 1950s isn't entirely our fault. It's the fault of a country which was a closed, hyper-secret society called the Soviet Union, which wouldn't give out any information. One of the reasons we went to war against Saddam Hussein is people really in the government U.S. government thought that he had weapons of mass destruction. And it was his secrecy. In fact, it's fascinating. I don't see why more isn't made of this, that he was playing a double game. He was signaling to Iran that he had WMD and to the U.S. that he didn't. And this is interesting because it's illustrative of the kind of dynamics that you not only can get into, in his case, we did get into. All right. I don't think the 9/11 attacks, and we could argue about this, alone would have gotten Congress to vote for a war. They had to add WMD to prevent this guy. It had to be staged as a preventive war. They didn't understand the difference between preemptive and preemptive, but that's another subject. But I have a chapter in my book called The First Nuclear Age and the lessons from it. One of the other powerful lessons is every president played nuclear head games. Playing with games with these things, and I mean every single president from Harry Truman through the first George Bush. All right, including JFK did this. Jimmy Carter authorized the most provocative nuclear operations almost until that point in time. All right, what is a head game? It's a feint to make the other side think that you might actually not go to nuclear war, but escalate to intensify the crisis using nuclear weapons. Now, I don't need you. The historians have uncovered most of this stuff. When LBJ went on TV to announce he was attacking Hanoi and Haiphong, or Hanoi, the airstrikes on North Vietnam in 1964, B-47s with nuclear weapons were launched out of Torreon, Spain, because we knew Soviet spies were looking at these things, and they would report back. You had Richard Nixon even have what has become to be known as the madman nuclear alert, to convey to Moscow that he was so irrational with nuclear weapons that if they pushed him or they supplied North Vietnam, God only knows what he would do. All right. Now, I would posit that my view of the Cold War and whether it is or isn't like the second nuclear age goes like this. There's 2 points. One, the two nuclear ages are more usefully looked at together than differently, because each informs the other. All right. And secondly, there's lessons from the first nuclear age that do or do not apply to a second. But if we don't know what these lessons are, we will never pick them up in a second nuclear age. I have a list of about 15 of these in the book, and the number one is it's broadcast out of the first nuclear age, and it goes like this: you don't need to detonate a nuclear weapon to use it. You don't need to detonate a nuclear weapon to use it. The U.S. used nuclear weapons every single day of the Cold War. The U.S. used nuclear weapons to scare the Russians when we were going to launch conventional airstrikes off of a carrier against North Vietnam. All right. So I can see why we don't talk about this history now, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Okay. Judith, did you have a question? Do you mind coming around just so everyone can hear it? Okay, thanks. Oh, there you go. Thanks, Chris. Okay. Judith Miller.
Paul, a provocative, if depressing talk. Question, what are the implications of the second nuclear age for the, now something which has been de-emphasized, which is missile defense? I mean, could we once again reignite that? And second of all, in terms of lessons, we have some examples of countries that did walk up to the nuclear precipice and back away. Is there anything that could be applied from that first nuclear age countries that backed away to the second?
The first question dealing with missile defense is, I mean, let's see if I can phrase this as precisely as I can. I observe a sea change, an ongoing change inside Washington toward missile defense, to viewing it as the provocateur, underminer of arms control, and we hate it, to being something that we may have to have for very interesting reasons, which we can get into, which is, I remember did a lot of work with Mac Bundy after he left office. And I always ask him, because I'm of the Vietnam generation, and when I went here, this had some impact on this campus. But I asked him, why did you keep bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail when every one of your own studies said it wasn't working? And he said, you got to do something. All right? And so I think we're initially attracted to missile defense. You may have seen where the Iron Dome tests worked earlier last week, and this is to get the short-range rockets. We are really putting money into missile defense. It's still like the battle is just beginning inside the Washington bureaucracy, and I'm not predicting how it will turn out. I do see changes on it. As to countries which have gone up to the nuclear threshold, or worse, gone into it, who's gone up? Libya. Kazakhstan was in it. That's a complicated case for obvious reasons. But then you have the fascinating case of South Africa, which I think tends to be overlooked. And so there are other good historical examples, and I guess my view would be, let's learn what we can from them, use whatever insights we have, because non-proliferation is a lot better than managing your way through a second nuclear age. All right? Fewer nuclear weapons, all things considered, is better. I can construct academic arguments why that's not so, but I don't believe them. It's like the argument that academics construct about why the spread of the bomb is a stabilizing effect. Okay. I maintain that the only people who believe that are tenured social scientists, probably at a handful of Ivy League universities. And University of Chicago. We have mutual friends there.
All right, that's a question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Aray. I'm from Columbia University. Well, I come from Kazakhstan, a country in Central Asia that, as you know, declared itself a nuclear-free state, even though it has a sizable proportion of the world's natural uranium resources. And recently, on the Nuclear Security Summit in Washington in April, President Obama stated that Kazakhstan is a good example to be followed. What do you think on this issue?
I think he's absolutely 100% correct. That both in a rhetorical sense that it's good for the United States as an example, but I think Kazakhstan is much better off without nuclear weapons for the good people of Kazakhstan. I can well believe that the North Korean citizens would be much better off if they didn't have nuclear weapons. I have run war games both at Yale and for the government in the particular, usually looking on Iran, and every time I play it, when I put the students in there and say to you, would you go nuclear if you faced the world that they faced, they always go nuclear. All right. So we don't seem to, we seem to have lost the capacity to put ourselves in another person's position, which is really a very elemental thing, which I teach in a business school, and my students in the business school understand that if you're in a negotiation, you've got to look at it from the other person's point of view. And it seems to have been of declining effectiveness. But I absolutely think Kazakhstan made the right choice. And
But is there a possibility that other countries will do the same?
there is always that possibility, and I could be completely wrong here. And the NPT could come back as a universal organizer. I think the evidence is so contrary to that even though the future hasn't happened yet, none of us can know what the future will be. Boy, is it starting to be time where we start considering the management scenarios that I'm discussing here tonight.
Okay, Nick.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Standish. I'm a undergraduate at Columbia. Thanks for your talk. My question, when you described the second nuclear age, you mentioned that Iran would have nuclear weapons in this age and perhaps a terrorist group or two. I was wondering first, it seems as if the average American citizen, or if you would poll Americans, they would overwhelmingly say they're not comfortable with Iran having weapons, and definitely not with a terrorist organization having weapons. So how would you propose, if it's necessary to deal with that reality, how would you propose to educate the sort of American people on sort of how to look at it in terms of escalation and not containment, as you've suggested?
Yeah, I prefer the term dynamics rather than escalation because it's a little bit broader. I have not thought as much about that as I should have, because I see my role and others as going down this road and starting this debate by writing. And then the government will, what will the government do? The government will start to study it seriously or not. So far, I mean, let's be candid here. The Pentagon thinks that what I'm describing, or some significant parts of the Pentagon, that I'm absolutely correct. It's other parts of the government that don't, and I'm not even sure of that. I think what their attitude is really, geez, I have no idea how to deal with that. I don't know what to do. and I'm in high position, and I'm supposed to have answers for things that I don't have. So it's not so much that they reject what I'm saying as they really don't know what to do about it. And they're sort of, on this front, to observe the dynamics are really interesting. Because in several administrations, the intelligence people come in with all this information about what's happening. And then after a while, the recipients of the intelligence information start to get mad at them. Like, well, what do you want me to do? And I've seen this in several administrations, and it's Republican and Democrat.
Mickey.
The U.S. bureaucratics are very much part of this here. But I'm not finger pointing and saying that they come into work, they're trying to do a good job.
Hi, Dr. Bracken. I'm Mickey Kaufman from Columbia University. You mentioned that in the first nuclear age, the symmetry of mutual deterrence between the U.S. and the USSR was broken most significantly by the asymmetry of the power relations regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was what was okay for the U.S. was not necessarily okay for the USSR. Looking at the second nuclear age in a multiple symmetry, or an ideal state where you had a 5-pointed symmetry or a 9-pointed symmetry, and trying to avoid that nightmare scenario where you have to come to what you described as an illusionary proposition only being possible after a great catastrophe. Could it be that the power asymmetry that caused the risk of the first nuclear age could be a problem in the second nuclear age, and to stave off the likelihood of such a catastrophe, we need to look at global power relations in general and ask ourselves whether a unilateral American power is in fact a greater risk than a benefit?
These are really complicated, deep questions that we need more, that I need more help on. I think the country needs more help on. I would encourage people in this room raising a couple of issues which, let me just tick through them. One is, what is the nature, if any, of a U.S. nuclear guarantee? I can't be the only one who has seen one particular administration official, Secretary Clinton, virtually say that the U.S. would extend a nuclear guarantee, even if the word nuclear wasn't used in it, to U.S. allies in the Middle East. And it was striking to me, that was the end of the speech. There wasn't any comment from the White House like, oh yeah, well, it's a good idea, or no, we don't do it. And so one of the things we've learned in the first nuclear age was you tell the officials in the Pentagon and assistant secretaries that when it comes to nuclear weapons, shut up. Coordinate it in a central office or shut up. And we seem to have forgotten that lesson. And you could get really into guarantees that the U.S. would make, which we think are strong, but produce pathological complications in an n-player game. One of the greatest books of the 20th century is called Theory of Games and Economic Behavior by Johnny von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern. And one of the features of that book anymore is, people forget, is that if you have a game and the number of players in it goes up, you get completely different dynamics. Completely different. Let me go back to the Cold War. You know, everybody says the Cold War was a two-power bloc, but it wasn't. You had, after the 1964, you had 5 nuclear powers, I think, yeah. But they were pretending that it was a two-block game because it was a useful fiction for stability purposes. It meant that we would hold them responsible for China. Did we really think we could hold them responsible for China? No. But it was a useful fiction to pretend like we could. You know, I read these histories sometimes and they say that the U.S. thought it was a monolithic communist bloc. So I went back and started reading the New York Times for 1964 and 1965. You can do it, all right? It was completely understood in Washington that there was a fissure in the communist bloc by 1964. Completely understood. At the Rand Corporation, State Department, everybody understood it. Yet it was a useful fiction. This leads me to search for other useful fictions for enemies, and as I said earlier, this thing like nuclear allies could really give us a lot of problem. I don't want to mention any countries, but just as Pakistan could cause China a lot of problem. But it's very evocative. I mean, I was thinking about this the other day about the advance of conventional weapons in, say, groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, if they get them. It's not that they need nuclear weapons. I mean, if they can reach deep into Israel with cluster bomb warheads, and Iran has a nuclear deterrent, you can get into some really bad scenarios. But that's happened before. I mean, that's how the Kim Il-sung's attack in 1950 was viewed in Washington, as we knew he didn't have nuclear weapons, but we thought he was the cat's paw for Stalin and Mao. And there's new research indicating, well, people here are probably more expert at that than I am. So these sort of three-way games existed even back then. And even the Cuban Missile Crisis was a three-way game with Castro. But it was useful to pretend that it wasn't.
Okay, I see there's a question in the back.
Hi.
I'm just wondering if you could elaborate more on your discussion on cybersecurity. What exactly is the relationship between cybersecurity and disarmament, and what would you consider a cyber attack? And
Okay.
if you have any thoughts on what the international community should do to prepare for such a thing.
Right. My sense of the cyber warfare issue is that we have created a cyber warfare community and command in the United States, and that we don't look at this in a broader, holistic way. Okay. Technology advances then and now because of synergies between different systems. So when you, in the 50s, when you started to shrink the physics package for a hydrogen bomb, and then you had the invention of inertial navigation systems for warheads, and advances in missile propulsion, it was the convergence of these three technologies that dramatically changed the whole the dynamic at a techno-economic level. Politics was very important still, not saying it wasn't. We are in an age at least as revolutionary as the 1950s when you take cyber warfare, financial warfare, precision strike, nuclear warhead design, and there's one other I can't think of at the moment, but if you need it, it's in my notes here. And so it's the synergies between these things. When I teach at Yale, I like to go at 30,000 feet and then come down to ground level. Cyber warfare could be very important as a weapon to stun, blind, or paralyze an enemy command system. While there was time for incoming missiles to finish it off and kill the missiles of the other side. And it strikes me, if I'm the first person to think about that, I'm sure others have thought about it. But I haven't seen any papers written on it, that, in other words, the role of cyber attack for blinding command and control systems or command structure attacks to destroy them. It strikes me as not advocating it, we better understand this. As far as stopping this, I don't really have any good ideas on that. Because it's done at a decentralized level to the extent governments control it at all, apparently. I just wish that it would be broadened out and put into a more integrated systems analysis framework to better evaluate its true consequences on regional stability.
Earlier you said that if there were an exchange of nuclear weapons, if one or two cities were destroyed, that you might actually see a great power arms control system become plausible. Can you describe what such a system might look like, how it might work?
I haven't fleshed out all of the details, but one of the arguments I either lost or didn't get as far as losing, because nobody paid any attention to it, was in the recent talking to people in Washington about the nuclear posture review. I'm a big proponent of no first use of nuclear weapons. And China has declared no first use of nuclear weapons. India has declared. Russia has not. France and Britain have not. But I figure we could lean on France, or at least Britain, and get them to do this. And so anything that could start establishing norms among major powers who possess nuclear weapons, not letting in, like if North Korea declared no first use, I wouldn't acknowledge it as a serious proposal. But I would start building conventions and norms that stitch together the major powers. Because the discussions, as I understand them, about nuclear weapons between the United States and the major powers today are pretty much us haranguing them to join a U.S.-led sanctions team, which I wish they would, but it seems to me they're not going to do it. So if the U.S. would declare no first use of nuclear weapons, now it would put us in conformance with other major powers who have the bomb. To say that, what's the reaction I got about this with this argument? I didn't think anybody understood what I was talking about. I think the people that I spoke to in Washington involved with this were looking at what's going to be in the paper we send over to state next week in the interagency review. The capacity to think about long-term consequences of current decisions was, well, my bias is, and you risk as you get older thinking this. And I also, Gaddis Smith says it's okay to have a professor we both know at Yale. It's okay to have biases if they tell you what you are. But my biases are that the level of discussion on these things has gone really downhill about arms control, not just strategy.
All right. Okay, this is probably going to be the last question, so please come to the microphone. Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you. I just thought of something else because actually yesterday Russia passed the biggest defense budget that they ever had, which is like 2 trillion rubles or something like this. But what I thought about was that I thought about right now we are in a situation where we are running out of oil. And so people are turning towards nuclear power, essentially, for energy use. And Russia is one of the biggest countries that specializes in promoting themselves as providers of nuclear power plants. And actually, they recently bought the uranium deposits in Canada, and previously they tried to buy them in the United States. So they are truly a great power, and they are proposing to all the different countries in Europe that they'll build nuclear power plants for them. So we have the situation which is the combination of energy and maybe nuclear proliferation, because I think that once they are building these nuclear power plants all over the place, they are increasing capability
Right.
let's say, for nuclear proliferation.
No.
So
Big, huge problem, because it looks like nuclear power will increase dramatically for obvious reasons. And this means more fissile material in the world, which has got to be protected. And it's a very, very big problem. I believe that my sense is the U.S. government is not only well aware of this, is actually taking good planning steps to make sure that we will fund a lot of the protective measures or storage measures. But it clearly is not going to affect Iran or North Korea, who, in my view, will not allow storage of their fissile material outside of the country for rather obvious reasons. We might not give it back.
All right, I think we're just about out of time. I just want to mention something. I think many of you know, many of you are participants in the research component of this summer program, this nuclear summer. And I ask you all to stay tuned because we have students who are working on many of the questions and the problems that came up tonight about, why Kazakhstan gave up its nuclear weapons, what kind of nuclear program was the Shah trying to create, why also, other countries like Brazil and Argentina. We have a student right now in Rio de Janeiro doing research on why Brazil decided to discontinue its nuclear program. So we're going to be presenting that research, making it accessible. So I urge you all continue, if you haven't already, to look at our website for the Hertog Global Strategy Initiative. So let me, before I thank Paul Bracken for coming, let me just also thank Roger Hertog for making all this possible. Let me thank SIPA for providing this great space, the Arnold Saltzman Institute for organizing this lecture series with us. So thank you, Paul Bracken. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. Delighted. Thank you very much. Thanks.